Close your eyes and imagine the soft sway of a ship cradling you to sleep, a slow creak of aged wood, shifting under the weight of salted winds and distant tides. The sea, eternal and vast, stretches out under a sunless sky, silvered and still. Tonight, we will journey not to the glory of battle or the glitter of treasure, but into the mundane, the miserable, and the altogether unromantic world of pirate life. Forget the Hollywood images of swaggering buccaneers and gold-strewn maps. Real pirates lived lives far removed from those cinematic fables. Their days were filled with hardship, their nights restless, beneath sails worn thin and stars obscured by clouds. This is a slow unraveling of their world, a gentle descent into the details of a life you wouldn't want to live. But for now, let it lull you. Let us begin, quietly, with the ordinary rhythms of pirate life. The sun riseth, the clouds allow it soft and obscured, casting a pale grey light over the endless ocean. There is no gentle morning for a pirate, no fresh linens or warm hearth, only the stiff aches of another night on creaking planks, and the taste of briny air already thick on the tongue. Life aboard a pirate ship was cramped beyond imagining. Each man had little more than a hammock or a simple mat on the lower decks, nestled between barrels of gunpowder, salted meat, and scavenged cargo. Privacy did not exist. The air was close and damp, thick with the mingled scents of old rope, spilled rum, tar, and sweat. Every breath reminded them of confinement. Mornings began, not with leisure, but with duty. The ship required constant attention, sails to trim, ropes to untangle, leaks to patch. All hands were summoned with gruff calls from the boatswain's voice, which echoed down the decks like a bell that never stopped ringing. You rose if you wished to eat, and eating well, that was no pleasure either. A typical breakfast might be hardtack, a dense, dry biscuit, riddled often with weevils. Most pirates didn't even bother picking them out. They'd simply tap the biscuit on the table to shake the insects loose, or eat them for the small measure of protein they offered. If luck favoured them, they might have a bit of salt pork heavily preserved, of course, and never far from turning rancid. Water was stale by the time it reached their lips, stored in wooden casks that warped under the sun. Many preferred watered-down rum, not for the taste, but because it was safer than whatever festering grew in the drinking barrels. Once fed, the crew fell into their daily rotations. A pirate ship was its own kind of floating machine. Sails had to be kept in fine repair. Cannonballs needed stacking. Powder kept dry. Even on calm days, pirates scrubbed the deck with brine and sand, an endless, rhythmic task, designed to maintain discipline as much as cleanliness. When not working, some gambled with dice carved from bone, or played cards with greasy, tattered decks. Others mended clothes with borrowed thread, or sharpened blades with the slow scrape of stone. Leisure was fleeting, always at the mercy of the wind and the captain's orders. There were no weekends, no holidays, just the horizon, unchanging and endless. Hygiene was a forgotten word. Fresh water was too precious to be used for washing. A pirate might go weeks without bathing, unless caught in a storm where rain offered a brief rinse. Their clothes, often stolen from victims or scavenged from wrecks, were worn until they rotted away. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Toothaches, infected wounds, and other small ailments became serious with frightening speed. There was no ship's doctor, only the ship's carpenter, who might double as a surgeon, sawing limbs or draining abscesses with crude tools and no anesthetic. As the day wore on, tempers simmered in the heat. The sun, when it did shine, beat down mercilessly on uncovered heads. Arguments flared easily. A stolen flask, a misplaced knife. Even a glance could turn violent. Yet they needed each other. A ship could not sail with half a crew. Evening brought no rest. The ship had to be manned at all times. Watches rotated, even through the night. Some slept, others stood lookout, peering into the twilight for sails on the horizon, whether friend or foe. No one ever knew until it was too late. And so it went, day after day, with little change. The romance of pirate life fades quickly when you live it, hour by hour. No gold, no rum-soaked songs, just endless ocean and the whisper of rope against mast. But life at sea was only one part of their harsh reality. Soon, we will turn to the faces behind the myth. The men, sometimes women, who chose this path. When you're ready, say continue, and we will drift softly into their stories. Let us now turn gently from the creaking deck and consider the people who walked it, not legends, not caricatures, but flesh and bone, weathered by the salt and sun. The pirates of the Golden Age roughly, between 1650 and 1730, came from many shores, and for many reasons. Imagine, if you will, a young man named Edward, born in the coastal squalor of Bristol, England, or perhaps Jean, fleeing starvation in Marseille. There were thousands like them, lured to sea by promises of steady pay, or forced into it through press gangs and poverty. Some came from merchant ships, unpaid and beaten. Others escaped military discipline. A few were enslaved Africans who seized their freedom during shipboard revolts. The pirate crew was a patchwork quilt of desperation, defiance, and dreams deferred. Despite the image painted in popular lore, pirates were often reluctant criminals. Many began their maritime lives working legitimate job sailors, fishermen, or traders. But life aboard merchant ships was no paradise. Captains ruled with an iron fist, food was scarce, and wages were frequently withheld. Piracy, to some, appeared more democratic, at least on the surface. Once aboard a pirate vessel, the world tilted in strange ways. Hierarchies shifted, captains were elected, decisions, such as where to sail or when to fight, were often voted upon. It was a rough and imperfect democracy, born not from philosophy, but necessity. Mutual dependence forged a kind of harsh equality. No man could survive alone on the sea. Some names rise above the waves: Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, with his braided beard tied with slow-burning fuses to terrify. Or Anne Bonny and Mary Read, women who passed as men in order to claim their share of freedom. Yet even these figures, rendered mythic by time, lived lives steeped more in hardship than heroism. Take, for example, Blackbeard. He wasn't always a pirate. He began as a privateer during the War of Spanish Succession, essentially a state-sanctioned pirate, raiding enemy ships with the blessing of the crown. When peace came, his work vanished. Like many others, he simply continued, without the blessing. For a while, he captained the Queen Anne's Revenge, a French ship he captured and outfitted with 40 cannons. His fearsome reputation did more to win battles than actual bloodshed. Often, his ship's mere appearance was enough to secure surrender. But Blackbeard's life was short, as most pirate lives were. He died in battle in 1718 near Ocracoke Island, after being shot 5 times and slashed dozens more. Yet even this iconic end, often dramatized, belies the simpler truth. Piracy was not a life meant to last. And Anne Bonny, born illegitimately in Ireland, raised in disguise as a boy, and eventually fleeing to the Caribbean, offers another glimpse into this world. She fell in with pirates through love, first with the rogue Calico Jack Rackham. On board, she dressed as a man to fight alongside the crew. By all accounts, she fought with ferocity. Yet when captured, her life did not end in execution as one might expect. Pregnant at the time, she claimed, pleading the belly, a legal delay for execution, and vanished from history shortly after. Whether she lived quietly or perished soon after is still uncertain. Each pirate was a person shaped by circumstance. They were not born villains. They were born into a world that offered few choices, and sometimes fewer chances. You might wonder what bound such a disparate group together. In truth, it was often a codea, literal set of rules agreed upon by the crew. These codes varied between ships, but often included clauses about equal shares of loot, compensation for injuries, and the punishment of theft or betrayal. Breaking the code could mean marooning, or worse. And yet, the very idea of freedom from kings, from cruel masters, from a society that had no place for them, kept them afloat. For many, it was worth the risk. But life at sea could not be sustained forever. Food ran out, storms tore sails, diseases crept aboard. In our next segment, we'll explore the hidden relics and archaeological traces of this life. Fragments recovered from the seafloor, and silent shores that speak volumes about what truly mattered to pirates and what they left behind. Beneath the waves, beyond the reach of light, lie fragments of forgotten lives. Sunken wood, rusted cutlasses, fragments of glass, and copper coins. These are the quiet remains of an age, once marked by cannon fire and black flags. They sit on the ocean floor like whispers from the past. and in them we find truth. Archaeologists have long sought to piece together the realities of pirate life, and not from tales or songs, but from the cold silence of shipwrecks. One of the most revealing finds was the wreck of the Wider Galley, a former slave ship captured by pirate Sam Bellamy in 1717. Bellamy, sometimes romanticized as the Robin Hood of the sea, sailed with a crew of over 100 men, but the Ouida met its end off the coast of Cape Cod, shattered by a storm. Most of her crew perished. The wreck remained hidden beneath the sand for over 2 centuries until 1984, when it was finally found. What researchers uncovered was not a trove of glittering treasure, but a wealth of mundane humanity. Iron shackles, remnants of clothing, belt buckles, gaming dice, and a small silver pocket sundial. These were the possessions of men who lived on the edge, but whose lives were filled not only with violence, but also with ordinary, personal moments. Imagine holding a tiny comb, once tucked into a sailor's pocket, or a pewter spoon, still bearing the faint trace of a name. These objects tell us that pirates were not so different from anyone else. They clung to small comforts, a bit of decoration, a moment of calm. Further discoveries on ships like Queen Anne's Revenge Blackbeard's flagship have unearthed even more fascinating items. Apothecary jars suggest an interest in medicine, or at least the desperate need for it. Navigational tools, some advanced for their time, show a discipline and knowledge not often associated with the chaos of piracy. Even fragments of printed texts, like A Voyage to the South Sea, hint that pirates may have read during the long, slow hours at sea. And then, there is the ballast. Stones used to weigh ships down for stability. On many pirate wrecks, these come from distant places: Barbados, Morocco, Portugal. These humble rocks tell of vast journeys, of cargo routes followed and interrupted, a trail across oceans, buried ashore, on remote islands or beneath the dunes of forgotten beaches. Archaeologists occasionally find makeshift camps, places where pirates rested, divided their loot, or waited out storms. Fire pits, discarded bottles, the remains of livestock, none of it exciting, but all of it revealing. Sometimes, coins are found in these places, but more often they are Spanish reals, worn thin from use. Not the heaped chests of fantasy, but loose and scattered currency, carried in pockets or sewn into seams. And bones, sometimes, are found as well, quietly, unnamed. They speak not of glory, but of the cost. Interestingly, even the pirate flags themselves, those infamous Jolly Roger, are rarely recovered. Few originals survive. Most were not made to last. Made of sailcloth or dyed linen, they withered in the sun and wind. Yet descriptions of them persist. Hourglasses, skulls, hearts pierced by arrows. Symbols not just of terror, but of mortality, of time running out. In this way, archaeology paints a fuller picture. It strips away myth. What remains are the personal items, the practical tools, and the skeletal remains of lives lived hard and fast. There is no treasure map etched in gold, only a rusted ring, a shard of pottery, a child's toy, perhaps stolen or salvaged. Evidence that pirates, for all their violence and myth, were just people, trying to endure. Next, we'll lift our gaze from the wreckage and peer into the structure of pirate society, its hierarchy, its unexpected order, and the strange semblance of rules aboard these lawless ships. Say, continue whenever you're ready to sail onward. Now, let us rise slowly from the sands of shipwrecks and drift back aboard those worn wooden decks, not to witness a battle or a mutiny, but to observe something quieter and more surprising: structure. For while pirates are often imagined as agents of chaos, their world was, in truth, governed by a peculiar and rigorous order. You might find it unexpected to learn that pirate ships, in their own way, were among the most democratic institutions afloat in the early 18th century. While the navies and merchant fleets of the time operated under strict, top-down command, often brutal, often corrupt, pirate crews developed their own systems of governance. These systems were not utopian, nor were they entirely fair, but they were built out of necessity, experience, and a deep mistrust of tyranny. Each pirate crew typically adhered to a codea, written or spoken contract, known as the Articles of Agreement. These articles varied between crews but often shared common tenets: the equal division of loot, the election of officers, and the assurance of compensation for injuries sustained in service. A lost leg might earn a pirate 600 pieces of 8, an eye 100, not out of charity, but solidarity. On a ship where every hand mattered, caring for the injured was as much a survival strategy as a moral one. Before embarking on a new voyage, the crew would gather to read and ratify their code. Imagine a quiet moment on the deck wind fluttering through the sails, the scent of salt thick in the air as men listened to the terms of their conduct. They would agree upon the shares each man would receive, perhaps 2 shares for the captain, 1.5 for the quartermaster, and 1 for each crewman. Musicians, curiously, were often guaranteed rest on the Sabbath. Discipline was strict but oddly rational. Theft among crewmates, for example, was considered a serious betrayal often punishable by marooning on a deserted island with little more than a bottle of water and a pistol. Cowardice in battle could result in similar exile, but disputes over minor matters, such as gambling debts or petty arguments, were sometimes settled with a duel, or a simple fistfight, overseen by the quartermaster, who acted as both enforcer and mediator. The captain, for all his supposed authority, could be deposed at any time. His role was to lead in battle and represent the crew's interests in negotiation. But he was not a monarch. His word was not law. The quartermaster, often elected for his fairness and strength, held nearly equal power and could overrule the captain in daily matters. And who were these men, thrown together on deck? They came from across the world: English, French, Dutch, African, indigenous Caribbean, and more. Pirate crews were often more ethnically and racially diverse than the societies they fled. Some scholars even suggest that pirates, by necessity, created early forms of integration, if not equality, then at least coexistence. Everyone worked, everyone risked their life. That tended to flatten prejudice, at least for a time. It is important to note that these democratic practices were not born from Enlightenment ideals, but from the hard-earned lessons of abuse. Most pirates had once served under cruel captains, gone unpaid for months, or been beaten for minor offences. The pirate code was a reaction to that suffering, a way to ensure no man wielded unchecked power. Still, life aboard was no idyll. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Divisions between nationalities, rivalries over command, and the constant strain of hunger and fear made cohesion difficult. And the promise of wealth elusive. Ever distant could erode even the strongest bonds. There was, too, a kind of hierarchy among the pirates. Those with particular skills, carpenters, navigators, gunners, earned higher regard. The cook, often overlooked in stories, was vital. His ability to stretch provisions and manage dwindling stores could mean the difference between survival and starvation. And then there were the rules of engagement. Pirates rarely killed without cause. They preferred to intimidate, to frighten into surrender. A ship taken without a fight preserved cargo, crew, and hull. The black flag, often customized with skulls, hourglasses, or dancing skeletons, served as a promise. Surrender now, or suffer the consequences. It was psychological warfare, quiet but effective. When a ship was taken, the pirate crew followed their code. Valuable items were gathered, loot divided. Sometimes prisoners were left unharmed. Sometimes they were offered a choice: join or be set free. Very rarely was unnecessary violence practiced, unless resistance had been met. In this strange microcosm, pirates built their own world forged not in law, but in shared purpose and survival. Soon, we'll explore what happened when that world collided with those on land. How the elites of the day, governors, nobles, and merchants viewed this unruly floating society, and how some, perhaps more than you'd think, found ways to profit from it. Just say, continue, when you're ready to drift further into the tale. Let us now step ashore, not into a tavern or a seaside brothel, but into the cool, candlelit halls of colonial governors, wealthy merchants, and lords draped in velvet. The elite world, polished and perfumed, stood in stark contrast to the salt-crusted chaos of pirate life. And yet, curiously, their worlds often intersected, sometimes in secret, sometimes in scandal. The early 18th century was a time of growing colonial empires. The Caribbean, in particular, was a web of competing interests. Spanish galleons, British governors, French sugar barons, Dutch traders. Fortresses dotted the coasts, and plantation mansions rose like palaces amid tropical heat. Within these walls, Silk rustled, porcelain clinked, and powdered wigs crowned brows furrowed by profit and power. To the governors and merchant magnates, pirates were both a nuisance and a convenience. Officially, they were enemies of order thieves, rebels, lawless dangers to trade, but in reality, many port officials turned a blind eye or extended a palm. Take the case of Charles Eden, governor of North Carolina, in the early 1700s. He allegedly offered shelter and even legal pardons to pirates such as Blackbeard, in exchange for a share of the spoils. Blackbeard himself spent months living near the town of Bath, where he walked freely among civilians, dining with merchants and exchanging goods openly. These relationships were forged in quiet mutual benefit. Pirates brought in good sugar, spices, cloth, even slaves at lower prices than official trade allowed. Smuggling flourished under the veneer of legitimacy, and colonial officials, often underpaid and far from scrutiny, welcomed the extra income. Of course, these arrangements were delicate. When London took notice, crackdowns followed. Royal proclamations offered pardons to those who surrendered within a fixed time in an effort to break the pirate ranks without bloodshed. Many pirates accepted, tired of the chase. Others used the pardon as a brief respite before returning to sea. In cities like Port Royal, Jamaica once dubbed the wickedest city on earth, pirates mingled openly with society. The port was awash with wealth and vice. Gambling houses, brothels, taverns with imported wines. A pirate might spend a fortune in one night and vanish the next. The city prospered until it was devastated by an earthquake in 1692, which many contemporaries saw as divine judgment. Meanwhile, in London, the image of the pirate was more complex. Pamphlets, newspapers, and broadsides sensationalized their deeds. Some were vilified, others romanticized. The public devoured tales of daring raids and exotic lands. Publishers sold accounts, often exaggerated or fabricated, detailing the lives and deaths of infamous captains. These stories served both as warnings and entertainment. Even the courtrooms became theatres. Pirates captured and brought to trial often faced dramatic proceedings. The trials were sometimes public spectacles, with witnesses testifying in elaborate detail. The accused, dirty and sunburnt, stood before bewigged judges in solemn halls. Sometimes they protested their innocence. Sometimes they laughed. And yet, behind the grandeur of the courtrooms and colonial mansions, there were quiet exchanges letters unopened, coins exchanged beneath the table, ships mistakenly allowed to sail past watchtowers in the night. It is tempting to draw a clean line between the highborn and the outlaw, but history resists such neat divisions. The powerful, it seems, often tolerated or even enabled the very figures they condemned. For those in the upper crust, piracy was a problem only when it disrupted the flow of wealth. As long as the coins kept ringing, the sails on the horizon might be ignored. In our next chapter, we will descend once more into the ship's hold, into the body end, explore the toll that pirate life took on the human frame, the sicknesses, the injuries, and the endless struggle to survive without medicine or mercy. Now, let us drift beneath the sunlit deck, into the dim, humid space below. Here, among crates of stolen sugar and barrels of drinking water gone foul, lies another truth of pirate life written in the weary slump of shoulders, in the ragged breath of the sick, and in the hollow coughs that echoed long into the night. The pirate's body was not a canvas of glory, but of relentless punishment. Illness and injury were near constants, and medical care, if it could be called, that was rudimentary at best. Scurvy was the ever-lurking spectre aboard pirate ships. Caused by a lack of vitamin C, it began quietly, swollen gums, fatigue, and aching joints. But as days passed, the symptoms worsened. Old wounds reopened, teeth loosened and fell, and the body seemed to come apart from within. Pirates, like other seafarers, often lacked access to citrus or fresh greens. The hold might be packed with rum, but never oranges. To ward it off, some turned to folk remedies. Pickled vegetables, sauerkraut, or fermented drinks, when available, were consumed not for flavour, but in hope. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. Beyond scurvy, there were fevers that struck in waves. Malaria, dysentery, yellow fever, these diseases followed pirates from warm coasts and humid islands. A single mosquito bite could seal a fate. Stomach ailments from spoiled food were so common but even the healthiest pirates often suffered chronic pain and weakness. Imagine trying to fight a boarding action, or climb the rigging in high winds, with a gut roiling from rotten meat, or with a fever that makes the world spin and sway far worse than the sea. Wounds, too, were frequent and unforgiving. A slipped foot, a snapped rope, a cannon misfired injury did not wait for battle. With no true surgeon on board, the ship's carpenter often became the reluctant physician. His tools were made for wood, saws, clamps, knives. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, only rum and restraint to dull the pain. Infection was the true killer. Even a small cut could fester into something deadly. The salty sea was no cleanser. Bandages were scarce. Wounds were sometimes packed with moss or soot, in a desperate attempt to stanch bleeding. Some pirates bore marks of survival, limbs lost, eyes clouded, fingers twisted, yet they continued to serve, their worth measured not in perfection, but in endurance. There were also mental wounds, though less discussed in surviving records. The isolation, the fear, the brutality it must have left its mark. Imagine months without seeing land, the horizon unchanging, the noise of the sea constant and inescapable, storms that raged for days, companions buried at sea, wrapped in canvas, and slid into the water with a few solemn words. Sleep came in snatches, rats scurried through the darkness, the constant damp soaked into skin and spirit alike. It was a life of waiting for storms, for ships, for sickness, for death. And yet, pirates developed their own methods of coping. Some turned to superstition. Charms and talismans hung from necks or stitched into clothes. Tattoos softened crude, made with ash and needler served as personal totems or declarations. A skull might symbolize fearlessness, a mermaid, longing, a cross, hope. Others found relief in camaraderie, in the crude humor of close quarters. In song, played on battered fiddles or sung in raspy voices. Laughter, however brief, was a balm. Still others found solace in alcohol. Rum flowed freely when it could be stolen or traded, but its warmth was fleeting, and its aftermath harsh. Drunkenness dulled pain but sharpened danger. In rare moments, they might land on an island for rest. There, beneath palm trees and stars, they would nurse their wounds, cook fresh food, bathe in streams. But such reprieves were short. The sea always called them back. Pirate life wore the body down, steadily, like the tide wears down stone. Few grew old, most died young, and those who lived bore the cost in every scar, every limp, every missing tooth. Next, we shall leave the salt air and the cries of gulls behind for a moment, and explore a stranger aspect of pirate life, what they believed, the omens they read, the superstitions they followed, and the quiet rituals that lent meaning to their storm-tossed world. Amidst the roar of cannons and the groan of rigging, another world existed unquieter, more mysterious, a world of whispered beliefs, half-remembered prayers, and signs glimpsed in the waves or sky. The pirates' world was perilous, unpredictable, and often cruel, and so, like sailors of every age, they turned to superstition to make sense of it. Belief, for the pirate, was not always tied to formal religion. Though many were baptized, Christians, Catholic or Protestant, depending on their origins, life at sea did not lend itself to rigid practice. There were no churches afloat, no priests aboard. But faith still found expression, in ways both ancient and improvised. The sea itself was a creature of mystery. It could grant survival or snatch life without warning. Pirates often viewed it as a force to be appeased or respected. Whistling on board, for example, was widely frowned upon. It was said to summon fierce winds. A sailor who whistled might be silenced quickly by others, wary of tempting fate. Animals, too, were read as omens. A gull flying far from shore might signal land or a storm. Rats abandoning ship were a grim warning. Dolphins swimming alongside were seen as good luck, while sharks trailing the hull were harbingers of death. The most dreaded sign was the appearance of the albatross. Killing one, it was believed, brought a curse upon the entire crew. Some pirates carried talismans, a lock of hair from a loved one, a carved bone charm, a coin drilled and worn around the neck. These objects served not only as keepsakes but as silent prayers against the unknown. Tattoos held meaning as well. A rooster and a pig, tattooed on the feet or ankles, were believed to protect against drowning based on the old belief that these animals, often stored in crates that floated, survived shipwrecks. Anchors represented hope. A cross near the heart might ward off evil. Certain days were considered unlucky for setting sail. Fridays, in particular, especially Good Friday, were widely avoided, and naming a ship, or renaming it, required careful ritual. To do so without the proper ceremonies risked inviting misfortune. Ship names often invoked speed, vengeance, or dread. Revenge, Seahorse, Nightshade. Others bore whimsical names, even romantic ones, but always they were chosen with care. There was a strange reverence for death aboard a pirate ship. No cathedrals, no tombstones, but death was always close, sometimes sudden, sometimes slow. When a crewmate died and could not be buried ashore, a sea burial was performed. The body, wrapped in sailcloth, was weighted and lowered gently into the deep. A few words might be said. Some made the sign of the cross. Others turned away in silence. Ghosts were taken seriously. Ships thought to be cursed were avoided. Some believed that the souls of the drowned could cling to the vessel that failed them, haunting it, twisting luck and bringing doom. Stories of ghost ships adrift, crewless, yet intact, were told in hushed tones late at night. Whether truth or tale, they lingered in the mind. And then there was the Jolly Roger itself. Far more than a banner of threat, it held symbolic weight. Each variation carried different meaning. A skull and crossed bones warned of swift death. An hourglass signalled that time was running out. A bleeding heart, a promise that no mercy would be given. These symbols, painted or stitched onto black cloth, were not mere decorations. They were the pirate's declaration to the world, and perhaps to fate itself. Some captains were said to practice rudimentary forms of ritual, a blessing before battle, a chant as cannons were lit. The quartermaster might keep a small chest of charms or mementos, brought from home or found along the way. These were never openly discussed, but never thrown away. Despite their rough exteriors, pirates were often deeply superstitious. They needed to be. The sea gave them no certainty. Storms brewed without warning. Ships disappeared. Friends died. And so, in the face of such chaos, they sought patterns, signs, reasons. Their beliefs were a fragile comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. Next, we'll explore the end of it all. How the pirate age came to a close. The last desperate voyages. The hangings. The slow fading of sails from the horizon. And now we sail gently toward the twilight of piracy's golden age. The wind slackens. The sails hang low. The horizon, once teeming with opportunity and plunder, now glimmers with the final glow of a fading era. By the early 18th century, the Golden Age of Piracy, roughly bracketed between 1650 and 1730, began its slow, inevitable end. The world had changed, and pirates, once tolerated or quietly encouraged, became inconvenient. The chaos they brought now threatened the increasingly structured colonial and imperial systems of the day. The great European powers, Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands no longer saw pirates as useful. With empires expanding and global trade becoming more systematized, piracy disrupted profits. The informal arrangements that once allowed pirates safe harbor backroom deals with governors, bribes passed in shadow dried up under pressure from faraway capitals. Royal navies grew in strength. Merchant companies, such as the British East India Company, hired private security or sailed in convoys. Colonies were militarized. Coastal fortifications strengthened. The oceans, once wild and unpatrolled, began to see the spread of flags, watchtowers, and iron discipline. Governments issued pardons, offering pirates the chance to surrender in exchange for clemency. Some, weary from years at sea, accepted. They laid down arms, took up trades ashore, and tried to vanish into ordinary life. Others rejected the offer, either out of pride or fear, and continued their work. These became targets. One by one, the great captains met their end. Blackbeard cut down in a brutal fight with the British Navy near Ocracoke Island. Black Bart, Roberts shot during battle, his body thrown overboard by his crew to avoid posthumous humiliation. Charles Vane captured, imprisoned, and ultimately hanged. And there were the nameless thousands, captured, shackled, and transported to trials far from their homes. The executions were public, often staged as a warning. In cities like London, Port Royal, and Charleston, pirates were hanged by the dozen. The bodies of the condemned were sometimes coated in tar and suspended in iron cages gibbets along the shoreline, left to sway in the wind and rot under the sun. But even here, in this grim chapter, the stories lose their fire. Most pirates died quietly, not in battle but in jail, of fever, of despair, forgotten. Some fled into obscurity, changing names, finding wives, becoming farmers or fishermen. Occasionally, rumours surfaced of pirates living in secret wealth, or of hidden treasures never found. But most of these tales are just that, tales. The seas grew quieter. By the mid-18th century, piracy in the Atlantic was largely suppressed. There would be new pirates in other regions, the South China Sea, the Barbary coast, but the age of the Caribbean buccaneer, of the Jolly Roger and rum-soaked songs, had passed into memory. What remains now are relics, fragments of ships, faded maps, court records, and stories. In those stories, the pirate lingers part myth, part man, a symbol of rebellion, of freedom bought at terrible cost, of lives lived between waves and laws. But as the Golden Age faded, so too did its fevered dream. The sea remained, the wind still called, but few would answer in the same way again. And now, all that remains is to reflect. Let the creaking timbers quiet, let the salt air fade. When you are ready, we will drift into the final thought, the gentle closing of this long voyage. Just say, now, as the stars glimmer softly above a still and endless sea, our voyage comes to rest. The sails have slackened. The water, once roiling with ambition and peril, lies smooth and dark. In this quiet, the noise of pirate life, its hardship, its fleeting freedom, its harsh rhythms fades like distant thunder across the ocean. The true life of a pirate was not a tale of endless gold or romantic adventure. It was a life of deprivation and risk, a world carved from necessity, shaped by hardship, and carried always by uncertainty. Their days were long, their nights shorter still, haunted by sickness, hunger, fear, and occasionally camaraderie. We've traced their footsteps bare and blistered across splintered decks. We've peered into the dim belly of their ships, felt the weight of their superstitions, heard the groan of their bodies under toil, and witnessed the stark contrast between their world and the gilded courts that condemned them. We've watched their stories indone by one, beneath no flag of triumph, but in chains, in silence, or in the deep embrace of the sea. Yet there's something oddly human in the lives they lived, in the choices they made when faced with cruelty and constraint, in their search, however brutal or brief, for a different kind of life where one might share in the spoils, speak without being struck, and die on one's own terms. The pirate myth persists because it is, in some quiet way, a mirror, a distorted reflection of a wish to be free, even if just for a moment. But now, you need not chase such a wind. You lie warm, not soaked by storm. You rest on a soft bed, not a damp wooden plank. There are no rats here, no creaking masts, no hunger or fear of disease. Only silence, only breath, only rest. So let the sails lower, let the anchor fall, and let the sea carry you now, not into danger, but into dreams. Good night.